Center for Professional Education. I will kick off today's webinar and then turn it over to our speakers. But before I introduce our speakers, a little bit about the Center for Professional Education. The Center for Professional Education, which we shorten to CPE, is the department with UT's extended campus that offers career training and professional development programs for professionals in a wide variety of industries and their organizations. If this is your first time attending one of our webinars, welcome. We're glad you were able to join us. And now a little background on today's speakers. Amira Pollock is a leadership coach and educator known for creating engaging, interactive learning experiences at UT Austin. She teaches leadership and communications courses for CPE and the Macomb School of Business, among other departments. And back before the pandemic, Amira had been a regular presenter at South by Southwest, selected to speak at the conference for 4 consecutive years. Today, Amira will be speaking with Dr. Rich Handley. Dr. Handley is a longtime emotional intelligence and leadership coach at the Center for Professional Education and the Macomb School of Business. Dr. Handley pioneered applying emotional intelligence to business areas such as employee selection, organizational and leadership development, and sales training more than 22 years ago. Today, Amira and Rich will reflect on leadership in challenging times. Specifically, they're going to discuss the importance of emotional intelligence for anyone in a leadership role, because leaders are not immune to the stress and emotional toll of this incredibly challenging year. There will be time for you to submit questions and comments later. And with that, I'll hand it over to Amira and Rich.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We're going to jump in. The first question is, what is emotional intelligence and how does it impact our workplace performance?
Thanks for the question. The way I like to define emotional intelligence, it's a series of competencies and skills. And by saying that, you're saying it's not necessarily personality, but series of competencies and skills that influence a person's ability to cope with environmental demands and pressures. And it's more practical intelligence, if you will.
And can you tell us about your background in terms of how you came to emotional intelligence?
Sure. By training, I was a mental health clinician in the Air Force for about 20 years, and about 1/3 of the way, I started out in the clinic seeing patients, and then about 1/3 of the way through my career, I transitioned more into working on organizational performance. And as part of that, we were studying high difficulty jobs and trying to understand why certain people succeeded and others were not successful. And in doing that, we would administer a lot of different assessments to try to find out the differences, such as an IQ test, personality test, vocational aptitude test, sometimes physical fitness assessments. And then in 1995, Daniel Goleman wrote the best-selling book called Emotional Intelligence, which was a great concept, but at the time there was not a published, scientific, validated, published assessment. So around 1996, we were able to use a beta version of the first assessment of emotional intelligence, and we started using that with our other tools. And it turned out in the populations we were studying, the emotional intelligence assessment was the strongest predictor of success in these different high difficulty jobs. So from that point on, about 1996, the test was officially published in 97. So I've continued to use that same assessment even today with the classes at CPE.
So in these turbulent times now, what I think we all want to know is, how can we harness emotional intelligence to lead when it's more important than ever?
I think what I see day to day, the area that's impacting people the most, 2 areas of emotional intelligence reflect general mood, and that's happiness and optimism. And those 2 are the most subject to day-to-day conditions. So what I see it with a lot of people today, they're struggling particularly with those 2 areas, maintaining an optimistic outlook, and part of that's part associated with happiness. Another thing I think leaders have to demonstrate today is stress tolerance, because it is very difficult, stressful times. And the bigger skill that I've seen through the many different occupations that I assessed, they all would have different competencies that would differentiate the high performers. But most of the time, there was a core of about 4 or so that were always part of that successful group. And so the most important one I could share today is self-actualization, which is maintaining a sense of vision even in difficult times. Because when that's strong, it typically strengthens a person's happiness, optimism, and self-regard. And then the other two that I would see constantly being part of successful models was one, stress tolerance, and the other one was flexibility, which is adaptability. So when you have stress tolerance and flexibility together, it equals resilience. So today, I think resilience is a key trait that you hear a lot of people talking about. So I think those are the key areas I think leaders have to particularly be strong in today.
Mhm. And another area that you and I talked about before that is a key aspect of emotional intelligence is leadership presence. And we have that in common with what we teach. How does leadership presence come into play here?
Yeah, so I like the term leadership presence, because the assessment that I use, it measures 16 different areas, which is a very broad and large amount of competencies. So a lot of times when I used to work with leaders, they would say that's too many things for me to focus on. Cut it down and give me a smaller subset. So in doing that, there's a 360-degree version of this assessment that I co-authored along with original authors. So I went to the 360 and tried to see which traits can people really accurately tell about a person, and those would be the more important ones. So leadership presence. First, I would say that by using an assessment, it gives you a way to actually quantify leadership presence, at least from the emotional intelligence factors. And so they're very basically, number one, it's what's your sense of vision, and that's measured by self-actualization. The second one, group R, is how well can you control yourself, which is stress tolerance and impulse control. Another area is how do you project outwardly to others, and these 3 traits are the most easily seen by others: happiness, optimism, and self-regard. And then the last area is how well can you connect with others, which is empathy and interpersonal. So I try to focus in the training I do, as well as coaching MBA students, to focus on what's your sense of vision, how well can you control yourself, how well can you connect, and how do you project. And it just gives them easy ways to quantify areas of leadership presence and where they're at and what they might target.
When you talk about self-control and being aware of the messages that you're sending out and harnessing that, I think about the stressors we're all facing today in our personal home lives and work lives, some of which are happening concurrently. So, what strategies do you have to offer to be able to focus on these factors, give them attention, and rein them in with all the stressors that we're facing to be able to control that? Those impulses. I know I'm working with a lot of clients now that talk about being highly frustrated and highly reactive, which doesn't go well when you're communicating with others and trying to get collaboration.
Yeah, and I think, the thing I try to help people evaluate when they have assessment results, it's not so much about how high your scores are, but are your skill sets balanced? And so what I try to tell them, amongst these 16 different areas, skill set balance there would be no more than a 10-point gap between your highest score and your lowest score, which is very rare to see. So out of all of those 16 traits, impulse control balances about half of the strong. If a person had strong scores, impulse control by itself will balance half, and the other half pretty much is empathy. So I try those two sort of go together. So impulse control, I think every day the news cycle is plenty of evidence of poor impulse control. That when people are um, don't have good restraint or impulse control, they'll say or do things under the influence of emotion, which some people refer to that as an emotional hijacking that they wish they would have not said, and a lot of the damage they cannot undo. So it's a constant battle, I think, for fighting those emotional impulses and urges to not act under the influence of emotion. And in fact, the Latin origin of emotion actually means to move. So emotions do move people. So it's having a degree of restraint so that the emotions work for you, not against you. And then empathy, I like to refer to it as social radar. It's constantly evaluating in your interactions with others. Should I say this? Should I not? At real time live, as I'm talking, how are they responding to me? And that helps guide a lot of behavior towards other individuals and interacting. So for sure, those two areas, since they balance more than any of the areas, are two key areas that I think leaders have to be strong in today. Is that social radar awareness, and then the constant battle to have restraint in their actions. And I guess one thing I talked to a leader yesterday about is that relates to restraint. The single most important thing they need to do is validate others. And the most powerful way you can validate others is through active listening. So I try to tell leaders, you have two ears and one mouth. You should listen twice as much as you speak, but most leaders struggle with interrupting others, cutting them off, and dominating the conversation. So it's really important that, when people are speaking, even if you don't agree, letting them finish, replaying back what you heard them say as a way to validate them, because that's an important leadership skill that's cut short by poor impulse control.
And linking to that empathy and social awareness. If we're not listening, we can't relate at all and be connected. You also talked about resilience earlier. I wanted to come back to that since that was one that you identified as an important trait. And it's something that we so need in these turbulent times. Can you talk to us more about resilience related to emotional intelligence and how to increase it?
Okay. Well, one thing, when I hear the definition of resilience, I think most of the time it's a little bit not accurate, because a lot of times when people define resilience, they just say it's the ability to bounce back, but that implies a very short period of difficulty and then it's over with and you bounce back. So what I see today, that's not the case, that people are enduring long periods of very difficult and stressful situations when there seems to be no relief. So the key emotional intelligence skills involved in that, first is stress tolerance, which is this ability to endure difficult and stressful situations. And the thing about stress tolerance, you only develop it by subjecting yourself to stress, pretty much. So actually going through stressful situations can strengthen that skill. And while you're in those stressful situations, optimism comes into play, that even though it seems very difficult and day to day, sometimes all you can do is just to continue walking. Optimism is this belief that somehow things will get better. And then impulse control comes into play, which is the resisting the urge to panic or act out of emotion. It's just this constant ability to endure. And then flexibility comes into play, and that's the basically adaptability, that a lot of times people's reality has been altered or it's rapidly changing day to day, and flexibility is constantly this ability to adapt. And when you add flexibility and stress tolerance together, those generally equate to a resilience quotient. So I think that when you use these types of scores, it can actually help isolate a person. Like, you may be strong on stress tolerance, but you're very low on flexibility. So that's going to impact your ability to be resilient. So it allows you to take apart the components of resilience and how a person can target their specific area.
Great. And when I think of resilience, I also think about it being able to harness and be tied to a vision to keep going. So you talk a lot about vision as well. What advice do you have for each of us to find or build on our own vision in light of all the stressors going on, so that we
Okay,
can
great question.
head in the right direction?
Right. Okay, so if you were to tell me, like I said, I tested many different occupations, and we would build a model of what most differentiated the successful from the unsuccessful. And across all those models, the single trait that I would say is the silver bullet trait that was part of most of the models we developed was self-actualization, and that's about vision. You typically don't have find high performers that are not driven by a strong degree of vision. And so actually, I try to post EQ tips on LinkedIn, and I put a tip there yesterday on this exact subject about vision. So what I try to tell people is that, that maintaining a sense of vision is key to unlocking your potential, because if it's something that's part of your vision or something that you're excited about, that creates energy fuels drive, and drive unlocks potential. So what I think today, and what I wrote my post about, is most of us live too small, day to day. We don't and I stated basically, I think, but we don't ask ourselves big enough questions. So what I try to tell people is, you have to have a sense of vision bigger than you are. So the questions, the hard questions is, why am I on the face of this earth? What is my potential? How much of that have I lived up to? Do I give energy or take energy from others? Is my life more about me or others? And in the big scheme of things, the kind of goals that are, things that should drive you in terms of vision is, how can my career positively impact humankind? Not just having a job, but seeing that in the big scheme of things, this has a positive impact on others. Because what I try to tell people, and this is really a sad but true story, as part of my occupation, many times I would have to counsel with terminal people. Kind of odd, but physicians wouldn't want to talk to people about it. They would tell someone in mental health, go talk to them. And so I learned more about how to live by talking to people that are dying. And one thing that I saw they all wondered about and struggled with is, did my life make a difference? Did my life have significance? And when you think that way, the only thing of significance that can outlive you, and that will be your legacy, is what difference did you make in the lives of others? So I think part of that vision every day has to look for opportunities to live with a sense of significance, whether it's just day-to-day interactions with people, but always having that overarching vision of, and then the other thing that I also put in my little post, living with a sense of urgency. Because of the health crisis today, people should realize that things can change in a minute. When you finally get it and you start living with a sense of mission, the problem is you don't know how much time you have to accomplish that mission. So you choose not to waste time every day and only do things that are part of that overall vision that you have.
Thank you. Okay, so vision. I'm looking forward to reading your LinkedIn post later. I hope others will join me. I want to take some time to also touch on the Zoom or other virtual screens that we're in for meetings in this current reality, to see how that also could be improved with emotional intelligence skills. So for these meetings that we have taking place virtually, what can leaders do to influence teams without the many benefits of being in person?
Yeah, so it's probably the single most difficult thing to do, because we talked about presence is impactful. So when you're live with a person, your sheer presence can actually give energy and whatnot. When you're having to do it through video and sometimes audio only, another difficult thing is that social radar that we talked about, and it's the ability as you're talking to read people, read how they're responding to you, and then based upon your read, your interpersonal skills, literally you have to adjust on the fly. Am I talking too much? Should I talk more? It seems this person has a question. So I think the two things that I would recommend is, number one, slow down. When a lot of leaders are talking, they have an agenda, or they're feeling like they have to really accomplish something. And when you realize you're still trying to see people and pick up on nonverbal cues and whatnot, slowing down will help your radar have a time to read. And then the other thing is, I think leaders should, no matter what, even if you're dealing with a displaced virtual workforce, make a personal call to each team member at least once a week, not just depending on this group chat and whatnot, but checking in with them and how they're personally doing. Because I think if we're not careful, people are feeling this, even with these virtual things, this sense of isolation and lack of concern that somebody really cares about me. So I think just that personal call to check in and ask them how they're doing and whatnot, on a regular basis is an important thing leaders need to be doing.
Thank you. What other findings from your studies could be applied to improve emotional intelligence during these trying times? Comb through and glean everything we can from you at this time.
Okay. Well, I'll just tell you that probably the four things that I found. One study I did, it's one that was totally shocking, that I was for 3 years studying some special operations trainees, and they're part of the Navy SEAL team. But I would have never ever thought emotional intelligence would have predicted the graduates, because their failure rate in training was 95%. So we were trying to find out what's different about this 5%. And there was a PhD exercise physiologist with me who thought clearly his fitness assessments would predict. We tested their IQ, and their IQ was off the charts. Their average IQ was about 122 or 3, so they're all very bright. But when after 3 years, I tested about 735 of them. About 5 emotional intelligence traits was 95% accurate, picking every graduate. So the first one I would tell you is it comes back to that vision. They realize with these young people that if you're that smart and that fit, you'd never failed at anything in their life. So they purposely made them all fail something. So instantly, when they encountered difficulty, the ones that struggled started questioning their vision. Maybe this is too hard for me. Maybe this is not something that I'm going to be good at. And the minute you start questioning your vision, your stress tolerance decreases, because you will not pay a price for something you don't necessarily believe in. So that was number one, that the graduate group somehow, in the midst of big difficulties, did not question their vision. The second thing I saw, the ones that were able to succeed had higher stress tolerance and flexibility, which again, that's that resilience. And so part of that was, and then the third area is managing their mood. And so here's the way that works. Every single person failed. So when you would talk to the person that did not make it, they would say, this seems to be too difficult for me. I don't know what I was thinking. They would then lower their expectations. They develop lower self-regard, happiness, and optimism, and most would self-eliminate. When you talk to the group that graduated, they had this amazing trait to reframe negative events. So I could say, you failed, right? Yes. What are your thoughts about it? Yeah, I know I failed, but this was actually useful in teaching me what I need to do to improve. So they were constantly reframing negative events, which is what we need to be doing today, not letting it downgrade their vision. And by continuing to believe in their ability to succeed in their vision, it actually gave them greater stress tolerance. So I think today people's vision is being challenged daily, and it's taking a toll on quite a bit of people because there's a hopelessness that's occurring. So basically those things, the two takeaways is continuing, no matter how difficult it is, don't lose that sense of vision, and then manage your mood daily by policing your thoughts and reframing negative events. And then one I try to tell people daily is practice a spirit of thankfulness, no matter how bad you think it is. I encounter people every day that have much more difficulty than I do. And so it's always continue to be thankful, even though times are difficult.
All right, I've got vision, resilience, and managing mood. And when I teach about failure, I like to call it fail forward.
Mm-hmm.
So you're keeping the momentum. But we're going to take questions soon, so be thinking about questions that you have. But some final thoughts. What 3 things do you suggest we prioritize now to improve our emotional intelligence?
Well, I would say for leaders, the number one thing is not yourself, it's your people. And that would be basically practicing the trait of empathy that a lot of times I think in leadership, we only think about our world and not enough about others. So the strongest thing I think leaders can be doing now is focusing on their team members, those that they work with, and trying to, like I just said, have that human interaction with them regularly, to touch base with them, to support them. Next, I think leaders have to be vision casters. A lot of people are struggling right now for a sense of vision, and that's one way leaders can give energy to others, is constantly casting this vision that, even though it's difficult, there's things that we can look forward to. And then the third area is, I think leaders have to manage their mood daily and be a source of positive encouragement to others, even though it may be difficult. I think leadership is about giving energy, not taking energy. And when you have leaders that have low self-actualization and they're low on happiness and optimism, they tend to take energy from others. If you have the opposite, leaders that have a strong sense of vision and they're very positive and optimistic, they give energy and encourage others. So kind of the overall trait is using yourself to be an encouragement to others. And in doing so, they're the ones that basically accomplish the mission. And so I think that's part of what leaders have to shift from focusing on themselves, but thinking more about how can I encourage others.
Great. I bet you all have some questions, so we have some time to answer questions, and they can be put right into the chat box. And while we're waiting on questions, one other question I will ask is, how do we do this now? We talked about self-actualization and optimism and hope. How can we, what advice do you have for us to focus on those things now amidst the hardships that we face, so we don't lose that hope, that light?
Yeah, I guess I'll give you two tips. I just try to tell people, right now, collectively, we're walking through the desert. We had in our lives, we have mountaintop experiences and then valley experiences, valley or the desert. So I think anybody can be successful when things are going well in their life. That's the mountaintop. And it's easy to have vision, and it's much more difficult to walk through the valley. So one thing I would try to tell everyone now is the desert experiences of your life are the real graduate school. I talk to people, about resilience and whatnot, and I would say, have any of you ever had any classes on how to fail and how to recover, or how to suffer embarrassment and humiliation and how to recover? And nobody has. But yet that's the single skill that you have to master to be more resilient. So right now, just I think try to realize that the difficulties that you're going through, or we're going through, is actually strengthening you in lots of ways that later when you look back, it'll be something that, like I said, it's going to be the real graduate school of your life. And so, although it's difficult, embrace this as a period of learning and testing, and then just realize that you may be down in that valley or the desert now, but don't lose hope. Keep looking up, because eventually we will walk out of this, and I think you'll never be the same after this.
And Tyler, I see some questions coming in the chat box. We are ready.
Yeah. So we will go ahead with the Q&A. The first question is, how do you bring in or improve emotional intelligence when your workday is full of mundane tasks, and because of other responsibilities will be your work for at least a couple of more years? So how do you incorporate emotional intelligence into your day, where the task might be repetitive or mundane?
Well, I think I saw another question. I'll answer both of them with one statement.
Yeah.
It all begins with an assessment. So, because I think once a person takes an assessment, just like your doctor, they're basically no prescriptions, in terms of a lot of illnesses will ever be prescribed without a lab test or something to make an assessment. Based upon that assessment result, they'll then have a prescription. So I think what's different about emotional intelligence to me, rather than just telling a person you can take an aspirin and it's bound to help you, or you can do these things and it's bound to improve your emotional intelligence, I think you just simply say, I don't know. It's best to start with an assessment and find out what areas of strength do you have, what areas might be holding you back, and then how do you balance your skill set? Because I just try to tell people the job is the job, but the number one piece of equipment you bring to the game is you. So starting with you evaluating and understanding some of your skill sets and imbalances. For example, like if you're a very assertive person, prone to act or speak, but have low impulse control, you're going to evidence that behavior at work. So it begins with you just understanding yourself and how you might evidence some skill set imbalances. And then the good news, unlike IQ, you can actually improve some of these things. So it's learning kind of where you can target for intervention for the biggest effect.
All right, so we have time for additional questions if anybody has any.
And I'll take Kimberly's question on how to have controlled fails to increase your capacity. When one thing that I look at with failing forward and the business improv class that I teach is how to be able to leave your comfort zone, extend your comfort with discomfort so that you can have the risk taking that was talked about today and flexibility and manage ambiguity, harness your courage and check in to see where you're hesitating and where you're holding back. And you want to have a safe place for that. In the class, we talk about failure bows as one way to do it. But even if you try a new recipe that you've been afraid to try before, do little tweaks or something new at work, but that isn't high stakes because you want to make it where it's okay to have mistakes and then fail forward and get that momentum and that confidence.
Somebody had a question about the the Longhorn football program. So I'll have to cover that up, right?
And I did also want to note that Dr. Handley will be offering a course, Unlocking Your Leadership Through the Power of Emotional Intelligence, with us. And the first section of that that'll be offered in the spring is on January 25th. And I am going to go ahead and link that in the chat as well, if anybody is interested in that course, before I go on with the next question.
And also that course involves an assessment. It involves a personal written report where I analyze your results in a 30-minute coaching session. So I think that's the beginning for anybody, is to get assessed, understand your strengths, weaknesses, skill set, and balances, and then kind of start with that.
Yeah, and then the next question I got was curious if you see any differences in perceived impulse control between males and females, i.e. a male may be considered a leader and assertive, whereas a female may be perceived negatively for having those same skills.
Okay, so two different traits. I do agree with exactly what the person said, because I've coached a lot of senior female leaders, and some of them are older, and actually commented about that they had, at the time they were coming up into leadership, they had to adopt male-like traits, was their word, to be successful. And when a female leader was, say exactly the word you used, assertive, she was perceived differently than a male doing that exact behavior. So I do think that has been an issue. The other one I thought someone asked, is there a difference between impulse control between males and females? So if you think of all the traits, I would tell people more possibly physiologically based is impulse control, because I used to work a lot with kids with ADHD, and you would see that behavior, which is an impulse control disorder, more common in males than females, and it would be starting as early as 5 years old or so, and some would grow out, but some would not. So today, I think, I still look at lots and lots of assessment results, and I do see, lots of females with lower impulse control, but I think males, in my opinion, tend to struggle with that more. And I think some of it is more physiologically, based in origins, because a lot of the ones that I talk to, they've had histories of being diagnosed with ADHD and whatnot like that. But it's something you can't use an excuse. You can't go around and say, please excuse this behavior. But largely, it's just constantly choosing to learn restraint. And the other thing I would tell you about impulse control, I've noticed in certain occupations, amazingly, the people end up in the right occupations, because lots of, say, electrical engineers, CPAs, that I test, one of their more dominant traits is impulse control. And occupationally, you don't want impulsive accountants and engineers. So that's another thing that amazes me, is how people somehow end up in correct occupations based upon their skill set.
Thank you. And we still have plenty of time for questions if anybody wants to submit any more. It's also possible that I might have missed some questions before I hopped on. I can only see the chat from once I hopped back on, Amira.
There was one other from, as a leader with a generally pessimistic outlook, what steps can I take to be more optimistic?
Okay. So somehow you believe that you have a pessimistic outlook. And so I think to try to think about, two things, like in the assessment, reality testing is your ability to look at things realistically, which, if you're not careful, can be higher than your optimism. A lot of people would say I'm more realistic than optimistic. And what that leads to is more pessimism than optimism. So being high on ability to look at situations, but seeing the negative all the time, can be viewed as being more negative and pessimistic and not optimistic. So one of the things I try to tell people is, how do you know that you're viewing a situation correctly? So what's important is, I try to, particularly MBA students, teach perspective taking. So what that means is, rather than you just deciding on your own, what a situation means, which could be pessimistic, trying to seek perspective from others. What's your thoughts about this situation? How do you see this? And when you do that, you get a couple of benefits. Number one, you can see flaws in pattern recognition. If someone sees something differently than how you see it, that could indicate that you have a pattern recognition problem. And there you would just simply say, I'm curious what led you to that conclusion, because could be things that you're missing, and that could point out being an overly negative view. And then the other thing I see that's a benefit of doing that is, the most important thing that negativity will impact you on is decision quality. And that's where leaders are judged most severely. So I also tell people, you ask what's your assessment of the situation, then ask them the next question. Maybe never happened in a million years, but what do you think is the worst thing that could happen? And then the last one is, if it did happen, what should our strategy be? So that at least you can start seeing maybe where your way of looking at things may not be in sync with how others see it. And the other part I would say is, people equally struggle on the other side, that I'm too optimistic. So they have to do the same thing. They just admit to themselves, if left to my own devices, I would be too pessimistic or negative. So to help myself, I need to seek perspective. That would be the most powerful thing you could do.
Thank you. And we did have one more question come through. It was, emotional intelligence is still a subject rarely discussed or appreciated in the workplace. What is the best way to deal with a corporate leader who outwardly expresses a lack of empathy towards emotional people within their organization?
Well, this is always a great question to me, because people, even like with MBA students, they think this is this new hot thing, and the book was written in 1995 and the test came out in 97. And I just think for many years it's flown under the radar of people. And then the other thing I would see is a lot of people that scoff at it. They're not aware of, like I said, that at least the stuff that I was doing had business results. In other words, it's not just because what people try to lump it into, here's another fad that came along, it'll be gone, and there's no real business outcome. So, and all these ones that I was working on, there had to be a real business outcome that you could prove to emotional intelligence. And I'll give you the last example, which can help with people in the business world. So one of my studies was involving salespeople, actually, which is a very business-oriented topic. And then they were basically recruiters, and so their failure rate, their first year turnover, they would fire 25% of their whole first year hires after they spent 30,000 to train each person. So I thought the problem is you're not assessing these people skills, and that's why these people can't quote sell. So anyway, I tested 1,400 of them and isolated what's the difference with those that were 100% of quota versus below 70, and then we found it out, developed a model. And so here was the bottom line result. Just using that model from then on out to screen new applicants to that position, the turnover dropped 92%, would save 2.7 million in lost training. The more important business result is one of those people could outsell 2.7 other people. So I think when the business leaders scoff at it, it's because perhaps they're listening to the group that thinks this is another fad and doesn't really look at the business case for it. And you can actually, if you want, Google the business case for emotional intelligence, and there is a site that documents several of those studies done by lots of organizations where there's really a business outcome. It's not. So I think that's part of the dynamic is people are trying to lump this into all the other assessments. And the last thing I would tell you is so many people take assessments, but they don't have to have what they call predictive validity. So it'd be the same today when people take a COVID test, that assessment has to have strong predictive validity that if it says you have COVID, you do. And so the emotional intelligence test that I'm referring to, called the EQI, has extremely powerful predictive validity, or else we wouldn't have ever even used it in those studies. So that's, I think, trying to help them understand there's actually a scientific basis to all of this.
Thank you, Rich. Yeah, and of course, I mean, it should be noted that there's a difference between emotional intelligence and being emotional in the workplace as well. But there's no additional questions that came through. So before we wrap up, I'm just going to go ahead and share my contact information one last time. Just if anybody has any questions regarding Dr. Handley's class, you can go ahead and reach out to me at the email address that I'm going to provide here in just a second. So the email address for all of Dr. Handley's classes is tecbiz@austin.utexas.edu. My phone number is also available there as well. And really, we just wanted to take a moment and say thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Rich, and thank you, Amira, for facilitating this discussion.
My pleasure. I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thank you. And then I would encourage you to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm not sharing anything about myself, but I did post 2 EQ tips there in the last two in the last 5 days. So that's my job, is to try to post things that can help people. So that might be a benefit to you. But thank you for all for attending.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon, everybody.